Well, welcome everyone. My name is Marcin Kosman. I'm a PhD student at the University of Warsaw. As you can see, my presentation is the last of today's conference, so let's end on a relatively high note, I hope. Right, so before we get into details, let me talk about the background of the party. Confederation Liberty and Independence is a Polish right-wing coalition which was established at the end of 2018. Initially, the coalition was established by two major parties: Coalition for the Renewal of the Republic, Liberty and Hope, simply known as Korwin, and National Movement, so in Polish Ruch Narodowy. The two parties decided to join forces for the Europarlament elections in 2019, and later on it was joined by other smaller parties, such as Union of Christian Families or Confederation of the Polish Crown. In fact, they did not manage to introduce any MPs to the European Parliament, but just a few months after, in the 2019 Polish parliamentary elections, they managed to obtain 11 seats. Both Korwin and National Movement introduced 5 MPs to the parliament, and the last seat was picked up by Grzegorz Braun, the leader of Confederation of the Polish Crown, who was also a runner-up in the 2019 Gdańsk elections. Before the 2020 presidential elections, Confederation organized presidential primaries, which included an American-style delegate systems. There were 16 conventions, during which presidential electors were selected, and the final convention took place on January 18th in Warsaw. Krzysztof Bosak, vice chairman of National Movement, won the elections. In the final round he beat Grzegorz Braun, and other candidates included Artur Dziambor or Janusz Korwin-Mikke, who was the founder of the Korwin party. The formula of the voting was rather dynamic, because the candidates were getting eliminated from the presidential race one by one, and after having been eliminated, a losing candidate was invited to the podium, where he thanked his or her supporters for the votes and conceded the loss. And unlike during American primaries, the participants did not know who the victor would be until the final round, so the concession speeches of the Confederation candidates differed from the prototypical type of the genre, as in a standard concession speech, a losing candidate concedes his or her loss to the victor, and the results were not predictable until the final round, as in the penultimate round, it was actually Grzegorz Braun who had more votes than Krzysztof Bosak. Let me just give you a quick overview of candidates in these associations. As you can see, we have lots of candidates from Korwin party. 4 of them were actually from this party. Krzysztof Bosak represented National Movement, and last three candidates represented smaller organizations or independent clubs. And the point of my presentation is to discuss Krzysztof Bosak's acceptance speech and to discuss its generic characteristics, as well as to present his discursive construction of social actors. And let me now refer to Richard Neville-Shepard, who discusses 5 most prominent features of the genre. So first, the candidate accepts the nomination of the party and then proceeds to take the role of the party's new leader. Secondly, he stresses the importance of the party's unity, as it is a necessary factor in having a successful campaign in the general elections. In order to strengthen that unity, the nominee thanks his or her rivals and subsequently acknowledges common goals that are shared by all members of the party. What is more, nomination acceptance address allows the candidate to present his or her unique vision, which helps the nominee discern from other candidates and persuade the audience that his or her vision is the best for the country. And as regards American candidates, they usually achieve that by mentioning their guidance philosophies and policies. Also, candidates discuss their past accomplishments and experience Although these factors have started to be mentioned fairly recently, only after party conventions started being televised. What is more, the candidates tend to rely on a ceremonial style, and their register is usually quite high. Finally, the overall tone of acceptance addresses is rather positive. While there are occasional attacks on political enemies, the candidates try to present themselves in rather positive light. But what needs to be taken account here is the fact that the majority of research on the presidential nomination acceptance address is devoted to American presidential primaries. This form of selecting a presidential candidate is typical for the United States, but it's not particularly popular in European countries. The fact that presidential primaries are a relatively new phenomenon on the Polish political scene suggests that presidential nomination acceptance speech might form a new genre in the Polish context. In Poland, before the 2020 Confederation primaries, presidential primaries were organized only twice. 10 years ago and in 2019, both times by Civic Platform. However, what needs to be discussed here is the fact that the Civic Platform primaries were restricted only to the members of the party. And in both cases, there were only 2 candidates. And 9 candidates took part in the Confederation primaries. And like I said before, there were also 16 party conventions. During the primary campaign, there were also numerous debates with the candidates and meetings with voters. Thus, the situational requirements as regards both primaries were considerably different. And now let me discuss my methodology in order to verify the extent to which Krzysztof Bosak's speech resembles a standard presidential acceptance speech. Generic criticism will be applied, and in general one can distinguish between 3 fundamental methods of generic criticism, mainly generic description, generic participation, and generic application. And in the present study, Bosak's speech will be analyzed with the help of generic participation, and you can see the 3 steps of it on a slide. And I will also add that genre here is defined in congruence with Rhetorical Genre Studies, so as a response to socially conditioned situations. So aside from establishing generic characteristics of Bosak's presidential nomination acceptance speech, the presentation will discuss his strategies with regard to his discursive representation of social actors. And in the presentation, discourse historical approach will be applied, and a selection of his discursive strategies will also be investigated. Due to time and space constraints, I cannot discuss all 5 strategies. I will focus on nomination predication strategies, argumentation strategies, and intensification/mitigation strategies. So first, nomination strategies, they involve discursive construction of social actors and actions undertaken by them. The speaker might form in-groups and out-groups with the help of various devices, such as metonymies, metaphors, synecdoches, and so on, as well as nouns and verbs which are used to denote actions and processes. Predicational strategies, on the other hand, characterize and qualify constructed social actors, and the aim of that strategy is to attribute certain features to them, which can be done through explicit predicates, metaphors, and other rhetorical figures, as well as stereotypical attributions of positives or negative traits. And oftentimes it is difficult to separate nomination and predication strategies, especially when the act of denotation is accompanied by an evaluative assessment of social actors. That is why in this presentation they will be grouped together. Then argumentation strategies are used to legitimize positive or negative attributions. And one of the most important notions as regards argumentation strategies are topoi, as they define the head of the argument, and they are considered to be conventionalized argumentation phrases, where warrants are not usually challenged or explained further. they also tend to be based on a taken for granted warrant. They can also be made explicit with the use of such phrases such as if X then Y, or Y because X. And also intensification and mitigation strategies, and this strategy helps to modify and qualify the epistemic status of a proposition by intensifying or mitigating the illocutionary force of utterances, and the strategies will be discussed within the realm of Van Dijk's ideological square. This is a crucial context in discourse historical approach, and the idea of that square is that social actors tend to emphasize our positive qualities, so within an in-group, and also emphasize their, so within an out-group, emphasize their negative traits, and also de-emphasize their positive qualities, and de-emphasize our negative traits. So let me now proceed to the analysis. Krzysztof Bosak starts his speech by thanking the audience. He thanks for the support he received during the campaign, and firstly he expresses his gratitude towards the party's supporters and highlights that the primaries wouldn't have been possible without their dedication. He also considers their support a sign of hope. As you can see, he expresses a clear preference for first-person plural, because he uses we instead of I, and he emphasizes the concept of a shared victory rather than simply his own success. One might observe that he strengthens his ethos by expressing his passion and showing his emotions. He does not speak from the position of authority. As I mentioned earlier, he introduces that concept of a shared victory. After that, Bosak points out that the party consists of various movements and parties and acknowledges their significance. As after thanking everyone, he decides to call for unity, and he also pays respect to the leaders of other organizations which form the coalition. And interestingly enough, for example, Janusz Korwin-Mikke's relative lack of electoral success was not mentioned, but on the other hand, Bosak focused on his experience and referred to him using his formal credentials, for example, Mr. Chairman. And similarly, Grzegorz Braun and Paweł Skutecki, leaders of smaller organizations, were also acknowledged. And at the end of the speech, at the end of this part of the speech, Bosak states that there are internal divisions within his own party as well. Also, in a way, he tries to expand his discursive community and he creates an impression that it is larger than it really is by enumerating all entities comprising each formation that constitutes Confederation. It will be better seen on the next slide when it will be acknowledged. But now let me just add that the candidate concludes this part by stating that despite the differences, all organizations within Confederation are united by the common cause of being true to their ideas and values, as referring to values and anti-values is also a critical part of Bosak's speech. Here, as you can see, there are strategies of nomination and predication which refer to positive self-presentation. And first, Confederation and members of Confederation are acknowledged. For example, here we have Janusz Korwin-Mikke, who is being referred to as Mr. Chairman, a person who has always obtained good electoral results, which in fact is far from truth because he never actually got more than 3% in the presidential elections, and also his experience is highlighted. He has been in politics for so many years, an organized person who convinced many people to join the party, and the leader. And also, in this subsection, a bit below, you can see references to the supporters of Janusz Korwin-Mikke and this strategy of enumeration, which again, it makes it sound as if Confederation is in fact bigger than it really is, because when discussing supporters of Janusz Korwin-Mikke, Bosak enumerates conservative liberals, classic liberals, libertarians, liberal monarchists, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the strategy of positive self-presentation was applied as regards Grzegorz Braun and national movement. As you can see, Grzegorz Braun was described as a leader, just as Janusz Korwin-Mikke, and a person whose contribution to the success of the party are immense. And also, as you can see, the strategy of enumeration, because supporters of Grzegorz Braun are being referred to as conservatives, traditionalists, traditional Catholics, and so on and so forth. And despite the fact that the party's electoral success is rather minimal, this enumeration signifies the fact that Bosak tries to present it as way more important than it really is. And he uses a similar strategy with regard to national movement, because he enumerates nationalists, patriots, national radicals, national monarchists. So he is fairly consistent as regards positive self-presentation here. Then in his speech, Krzysztof Bosak proceeds to discuss his values and present his unique vision. And the declaration of values that unite Confederation is the theme of the third part of the speech. Here, the candidate lays out his vision of Poland. He stresses the fact that despite the party is not homogeneous, they share a common set of values, which is the basis of Bosak's vision. In fact, he considers his vision to be a backbone of Polish culture, and he mentions the pillars of it. So patriotism, conservatism, common sense, Christian ethics is also here, economic freedom, and civic ethos. The candidate argues that if these values were implemented, Poland would be a better place. And his argumentation strategies with regard to the values he cherishes are based on topos of advantage. Right? If Bosak is selected, then our Polish state, our civilization, will be better. On the other hand, Bosak also discusses pseudo-values, and he uses a topos of threat to discuss them. Right? The benefits and advantages of his potential presidency are clearly contrasted with dangers that are associated with others, and the threats identified by Krzysztof Bosak are usually connected with the European Union and its action. The candidate first and foremost argues that further European integration may result in Poland losing its independence. And as you can see here, he uses the topos of threat, but while discussing some potential characteristics of his presidency, topos of advantage was used. So clearly he uses a stark contrast to differentiate between his values and pseudo-values that he fights against. This enumeration of pseudo-values is accompanied by negative order presentation, so another strategy of contrast here. So in the first part of that, he discusses law and justice and civic platform, so two of the mainstream Polish parties, two of the most powerful Polish parties. And with regard to law and justice, which is the ruling party in Poland and has been ruling for a few years, here we have some examples of Bosak's rhetoric. For example, he emphasizes the fact that law and justice constantly brings the state into debt, and similarly it gives away our independence. And despite the fact that Law and Justice is considered to be a right-wing party, Krzysztof Bosak argues that it is all superficial, because in fact it supports further European integration and makes it very difficult to experience national pride. Also, Civic Platform, so another powerful party, is mentioned here. Here is referred to as a cartel party, and this was the party which mortgaged the future of Poland, and despite the fact that there were also presidential primaries more or less at the same time when it comes to Civic Platform and Confederation, the primaries of Civic Platform were staged. They were not authentic because everything connected with Civic Platform is somehow artificial. In terms of negative other presentation, there seems to be a hierarchy between enemies, because having described Polish mainstream politicians as highly incompetent, Krzysztof Bosak proceeds to discuss additional enemies, which in fact are considerably more powerful than their Polish counterparts. In fact, both the West and George Soros seem to be in control of Polish mainstream politicians, because Polish mainstream politicians are portrayed as devoid of power and significance, and points out that their actions are influenced by more powerful entities, which are the West and George Soros. And on this slide you can see another instance of intensification by contrast, because having discussed the enemies, Bosak proceeds to discuss Confederation as a whole. He calls his party a team, a new quality, and also a project. And as you can see, the positive qualities of the party are emphasized, and they are contrasted with negative qualities of the enemies, as were discussed 2 slides ago. So in the final part of the speech, Krzysztof Bosak accepts the party's nomination, and he considers it to be a mission assigned to him by the groups he mentioned throughout the speech. He also states that he feels a great deal of responsibility, and once again he switches back to the first person plural. For example, at the end he says, "Let's win this round together." He highlights that it's not only his task. He's also convinced that every proponent of the party will offer him his or her support along the way. Here we might observe that he reverts back to the mitigation strategy that he implemented at the beginning of the speech. Because while the candidate does accept the position of the leader, he does not intend to impose his will on the party, but rather he pledges to fight for the common goal and highlights the fact that it is not his task and he cannot compete on his own. He needs the support of every proponent of the party. And thus, as regards his discursive strategies, Krzysztof Bosak clearly uses the us-them dichotomy, which seems to be exponentially strong. Furthermore, positive qualities are ascribed solely to Confederation, whereas negative traits are amplified and ascribed to its opponents. And the opponents include not only Polish mainstream parties, but also the West, the European Union, and all organizations by George Soros. Furthermore, Bosak mentions the benefits of his potential presidency in terms of topos of advantage, whereas the actions of others are discussed with the help of topos of threat. And also, candidate stresses the importance of other members of the party and its supporters. Once again, he uses that enumeration strategies, and he tries to enlarge his discursive community, make it bigger than it is in reality. As regards generic criticism, structurally speaking, one might observe that the speech does bear resemblance to standard nomination acceptance speeches. However, particularly with regard to the tone, there are significant differences, because as William Benoit observes, normally in presidential nomination acceptance addresses, both Democrats and Republicans tend to acclaim considerably more than attack. The proportions are approximately 70 to 30%. As we can see here, the proportion between acclaims and attacks in Krzysztof Bosak's speech are about 50% each. So in terms of the tone, we can see that there is a difference between the American genre and the Polish presidential nomination acceptance speech by Krzysztof Bosak. However, overall, it seems that the American genre appears to be successfully transposed into the Polish context. Of course, it is impossible to decide whether it forms a separate genre. Such a claim definitely requires further research, although it might seem that it is a fairly new tool on the Polish political scene, and it's going to be interesting to see if it evolves to a sort of a hybrid form. Right, thank you for your attention. I hope to develop my thoughts further in the paper, and I suppose that is the end of the conference. Thank you once again for your time.